This is a tale about an outlaw who lived in the old days. There were many outlaws in the old days. Some were noble and good-hearted, some were evil villains, some were a bit of both. You probably know about Robin Hood, but Hertfordshire had its own outlaw who could run rings around Robin. His name was Jack-a-legs. Jack lived in the village of Weston, and he was a giant. He was so big that when he died, the biggest plot they could find to bury him was only 14 feet long, so they had to double him up to fit him in. Jack was a great archer. Robin Hood is famous for splitting an arrow in two, but Jack could have done that in his sleep. It's said that Jack could put an arrow through a rook from half a mile away, though I think the real trick was to see the rook from that distance. His greatest feat of archery, though, makes this look ordinary, but that comes later. All outlaws had somewhere they preyed on their victims, and Jack's was the Great North Road near Gravely. That's the A1 to you and me, and it was almost as dangerous to travel on then as it is now. From a hill, known as Jack's Hill, he'd spy out rich-looking travellers on the road and swoop down on them. After relieving them of the burden of having to carry their riches, he'd retreat to a cave nearby where he stored his plunder. That was called Jack's Cave. They were inventive back in the old days. Jack was the scourge of the rich, but for the poor it was a different matter. He was always willing to give some of his spoils to the needy, and if he heard of anyone cheating or exploiting the poor, he was angry. And you didn't want to make Jack angry. And that's how Jack came to have a feud with the bakers of Baldock, which proved his undoing in the end. They were notorious for selling short measures, and Jack wasn't having that. One market day, the bakers all had their stalls set up, and they were feeling very pleased with themselves. They were raking it in, and no one was getting what they paid for, but the people could do nothing about it, because all the bakers were as bad as one another. Suddenly there came a thumping and a roaring from the distance. It sounded as if a herd of elephants with especially nasty toothache were bearing down on the market. The people exchanged glances, and they gathered their possessions and their children, ready to run for it. Then into the market strode Jack-a-legs. He towered above everyone, and even above many of the houses, and one look at his face far above the street would tell you he wasn't pleased. "What's all this I hear?" he roared. "Cheating hard-working people with short measures? You're nothing but a bunch of crooks," he told the bakers, evidently without irony. The bakers took one look at him, another look at each other, and fled from their stalls, which was as well for them, because Jack strode in among them, kicking the stalls over, scattering the bread and trampling it into the dirt, before storming off again. The bakers lost a lot of money that day. Of course, many poor people didn't have any bread either, and opinion was divided on whether Jack had done them a good turn or not. Still, he'd stood up for them against the corrupt bakers, and that was what rarely counted. This happened again and again, till the bakers got together and decided something had to be done about Jack. So they formed a plan. They sent an anonymous message to Jack, saying that if he came to Baldock churchyard that evening, he'd learn something to his advantage. Then they lay in wait, having set up an elaborate trap with ropes and nets and pulleys to snare him. Sure enough, Jack blundered straight into their trap and ended up strung up like a badly wrapped parcel. He roared and he struggled, but it was no good. He couldn't escape. The bakers rushed out and set about him with clubs and knives and bread tins till he was black and blue all over, and then they put out his eyes. It was clear he was dying, both to the bakers and to Jack himself, so at last, when they thought it was safe, they cut him down. "You've defeated me," said Jack, "and soon I'll be dead, but I've one last request. Give me my bow and a single arrow." "Do you think we were born yesterday?" asked the chief baker. "Even blind, I wouldn't put it past you to kill us all." "No," said Jack, "I'm done with fighting. I swear by the holy book that I won't harm a single one of you." The bakers still weren't sure, but eventually they agreed to the dying outlaw's request and gave him a bow and a single arrow. "I wish to be buried," he said, "wherever this arrow lands." And he loosed it off. Even with his strength waning, it flew high and far. It flew all the way from Baldock to Weston, and that's at least 3 miles if it's an inch, and landed smack in the middle of Weston's churchyard. And there he was buried, and his grave's still there to this day, a stone at his head and a stone 14 feet away, and him doubled up between. So Jack-a-legs died, but that wasn't the end of him. His ghost still looks out for the people of the district, and maybe he'll come to take vengeance on anyone who exploits or cheats them. And if you're driving up the A1 past Gravely, and you happen to look up and see a giant figure on a hill above the road, well, perhaps you'd better watch out, especially if you happen to be a baker.